school. Or maybe you answer, in the church I grew up in. Or, this little church I found that feels like the church I wish I grew up in. Or maybe it's the same church I've been going to since 1950. Or a church I found just a few months ago that seems okay so far. Or maybe you say Bodark Church, like Kathy Iman. Or Bodark UMC, like me. Some of you just say Bodark, as though there's only one church. Or like Greg Johnson, maybe you say St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Bodark, which is really very close to Springfield and a beautiful drive that is totally worth it. Today I want us to think about how we answer that question. Some people struggle with the idea of church. I know that may sound strange to you since you're here in one. But maybe you've struggled with the idea in the past, or it just seemed, like a place you didn't think you needed to be at a place in your journey. At some point, a lot of people who have decided to follow Jesus will decide that church doesn't need to be a part of that following. And they'll justify it, if they're Bible thinkers, by saying things like, well, churches aren't in the Bible, which isn't accurate, because the letters of Paul to the Corinthians were not to all of the people of Corinth, but to the church in Corinth. In the same way, and I know this is particularly confusing, Philippians was not written for the Filipinos, okay? Or even the people of the ancient city of Philippi, but to the church that was located in the city of Philippi. So yes, churches are in the Bible, lots and lots of them. Or they'll say, and this is closer to real but not, that the Gospels don't mention churches. And while it is true that there were not organized churches by the time at least Mark was written, there are mentions of the idea of the church. And this scripture that I mentioned last week, this is the time, that one time, Jesus talked about the church. Okay, we read it last week, and we took lessons from it, but it wasn't really the focus of Pentecost. So this is Matthew 16, 15 to 20. But what about you? Jesus asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. When Jesus talks about church, he talks about it this way. And I tell you, you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Last week we learned that Jesus told us this, that the church would, number one, start with Peter. Number two, it will prevail. And number three, that what it does matters. But I want us to look at this with a different lens today. I want us to look at what Jesus is saying at a really basic level. Okay, he says to Simon, the guy's name is Simon, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So is he saying, you are Peter, and on you I will build my church? Or is he saying, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church? Like there's a boulder nearby. Do you see the difference? You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The key to understanding Scripture, of course, is context, context, context. And we don't have to look very far for the context of this Scripture that will give us a key to his meeting. This Scripture is about naming. Right? Jesus just asked his disciples who they say he is, and Simon has just named Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus, named such, turns around and names Simon, son of Jonah, Peter. You are Peter. This is Peter. Oh, Peter, pumpkin eater. I didn't even think of that when I wrote that. Okay. We know Peter. We've been talking about Peter. And here is Jesus naming this guy Peter. Jesus said Cephas in Aramaic, translated into the Greek, Petros. In English, it's the name Peter. It's clearer in other languages. In the other two, it means rock. Right? You are Cephas, and on Cephas I will build my church. You are Petros, and on Petros I will build my church. You are rock, and on rock I will build my church. So this, you are Peter, and on this rock, this rock I will build my church. That's not right, right? You are Peter, and on you I will build my church. So when we hear or ask the question, where do you go to church? We're kind of acting like Jesus meant, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Like it's a location thing. And that's not the interpretation, because the whole passage is about naming. So it's about the person of Peter. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So what in Jesus' mind are our churches made of? People. People, not potential locations, people. I know this sounds shocking, but Jesus never stepped foot inside a church in his lifetime. Think about that. He never stepped foot in a church. He left the makings of a church for us. He left people who loved him. Did Jesus' disciples build the church once they started thriving? Jesus' disciples are building the church today, and it has very little to do with stones or metal or brick or plaster or sticks on the outside. It's all about the people. Jesus gave us the idea of a church that would spread his message of his great love after he left us. He gave us the church, called in the Bible the bride of Christ. And that church was built on Peter with a capital P, rock with a capital R. It was built on disciples. It was built of disciples. It was built by people, and it was people, and it is people today. So the question, where do you go to church, doesn't even make a whole lot of sense unless we decide that to church is a verb. Where do you go? To church. It's a bad question. But the idea is pervasive. This idea that church is a place you go. And we get to go to a beautiful place to be the church, and we take care of this building because it is where we have gathered for generations. And people have worked really hard through many, many years to make sure that we had a location for the church to gather. But the church itself is about people. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Once we start thinking of church as a place to go, it becomes a slippery slope. From being a part of what happens at church to watching what happens at the church to which we go, to wondering why that church we go to does the things it does, the way they do things, right? To not going there anymore because we don't like the way they do things. It's really easy to go from an us to a they. When church is a place we go, it can easily become a place we used to go. And once people get in that mindset, it's hard to be the church anywhere. Jesus didn't have in mind places we would go to. Jesus had in mind people. So my first Labor Day after I got here came in December. Well, Labor Day is in September. Katie Haley's house burned down. I got the phone call, and it is such a crisp memory. I remember we had given out prayer beads for the first time that Sunday. It was a really nice night. I remember where I was standing when I got the call, what the wallpaper looked like in front of me as I listened to what was going on. I remember that there was a Springfield phone book right here. It's an extremely vivid memory. I showed up at her house. Firefighters were working. Katie was outside clutching the prayer beads we'd given her the day before. They were made of moonstones, and they were white, except where they'd been scorched by the fire. We stood in her parking area, and we watched the building they called home burn down. It was so sad. And then other cars pulled in, and more cars pulled in, and it was you. I'm sure the firefighters appreciated how many of us showed up. Katie did. We stood around together and talked about what was going on. We talked about if her family had what she needed, if what we could do to mobilize and get them what they needed. We started organizing a fundraiser, I think, right there while the house burned. A lot of the time we just stood there waiting for the moments Katie might need someone so that we could step forward and be someone. We just made sure she wasn't alone for a moment. And we weren't sad about the building. We were sad about Katie. We were sad for the person. We wanted to help this person, our church person, because Katie is where we go to church. Later in the week, I went to see Katie and Danny at the house they were living in, and Katie told me and Danny, the whole church was there. There were maybe 8 or 10 of us, but the whole church was there. And she didn't mean the building. And we weren't there for the building. We were there for the people. That was the Sunday before Katie became a member of our church. Katie's where I go to church. We need to stop telling people we go to church here. All of us, young and old, new to your pew, or around so long the pew now fits your particular rear. Member and guest, teacher and student, teen or octogenarian. Some of you have been sitting in them pews, the same ones, for a long time. Jesus gave us the church to do his work, to keep us together and to spread good news. Jesus knew you'd need something, and so he gave you each other. So we need to stop telling people we go to church here. We are the church here. And I tell you that you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it.